the New Frontier Network with Chris Iverson and Victor Vigiani.
Welcome to NFN, the New Frontier Network, where we explore the new frontiers of phenomenology, ufology, and exopolitics. We're happy to have you all with us here today in our continuing journey of exploring individuals who have great insight to share and offer with all of us here as we explore these new frontiers. With me today, as always, he is
Victor Vigiani, and on the other side of that microphone is Chris Iverson.
Welcome, Victor. And of course, we have our fantastic group of international correspondents and panelists joining us here today. We have from Portugal, Francisco Mirao Correa. We have Giorgio Piacenza from Peru and from Miami. North of the border in Canada, we have Chrissy Newton. And we flip it right back to my co-host and friend, Victor Vigiani. Victor, why don't you tell us a little bit about who we have with us today as our special guest?
Well, our special guest is Ralph Blumenthal, and we'll get into the details of who Ralph is. But I just want to inject something. Over the past 4 days, I've had the opportunity to view two incredible movies. You know, that's the kind of stuff that we do on during this whole situation. And one movie was on J.D. Salinger, a fascinating movie, incredible writer. And then we just finished watching the entire 3 days of the Ernest Hemingway special on PBS. And both of these individuals were incredible writers of their time. I just couldn't believe some of the things that they decided to dip their fingers into. And they both became very profound individuals within the writing community. And now today we have, in my estimation, someone who's moved the ticket forward in a very positive way, in a very strong way, through the New York Times, that being Ralph Blumenthal. So I really want to thank Ralph for being a part of this today, because I think one of the things that has really set him aside, in addition to his other colleagues at the New York Times, is they've really pushed the ball forward with respect to the UFO issue. And now Ralph has decided to get involved in the alien abduction phenomenon with respect to the biography. We'll discuss that in a moment, of Dr. John Mack. So yeah, I'm really excited to get into this, because it's a profound moment in the New Frontier Network array of things that we're trying to do to advance disclosure. So yeah, I think it's important that we do this. And I'm going to read Ralph's bio right now, and then we can launch right into it. Ralph, I know you've heard this several times, but bear with us, okay? Ralph Blumenthal was a New York Times reporter from 1964 to 2009, serving as a foreign correspondent with West Germany, South Vietnam, and Cambodia. He's also a national bureau chief in the southwest of the U.S., and an investigative reporter and arts writer. He was a member of the Metro Desk team that won the Pulitzer Prize for the groundbreaking news coverage of the 1992 truck bombing of the World Trade Center. In 2017, he and two colleagues broke the story of a secret Pentagon program to track UFOs with videos of encounters between the objects and Navy pilots. He is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship Award, the author of 6 nonfiction books, and he's a distinguished lecturer. He lives in New York, in Manhattan, with his wife, Deborah, who was a children's book author. So Ralph Blumenthal, welcome to the New Frontier Network.
Well, thank you, Victor. And I must say, it's the first time I've been mentioned in the same breath with Hemingway and Salinger.
Well, if watching these two specials, Ralph, and I don't know if the rest of them,
yeah,
they were just profound. And I need to watch definitely the Hemingway again, because I find that writers who do things that are against the grain make the biggest impression rather than going along with the crowd. And I think you've definitely done that. So in saying that, Chris, do you have anything else you want to throw out there before we get to our correspondence?
No, it's wonderful to have you here today. And as Victor indicated, he was definitely touched and impressed by those two movies as he and I were talking about them the other night, and I've now added them to my must-watch list. But what we are trying to do here at NFN is to take a slightly different approach that from others that would be out there, other webcasts and blogs and so forth, as they are talking about this subject matter. We really want to push the frontier. We want to push the edges of it. We want to try to achieve an understanding of what is going on and why this has been happening. It's been obvious and deliberate for quite some time that there have been lights in the skies, objects, crafts, and everything else. Very interestingly, and as Victor will get into with the start off questions here, is your book that you've just written, focusing on John Mack, and of course, Mack's wonderful career and knowledge that he has spread throughout the community is incredible. And talk about somebody that was cutting edge and pushing the frontiers at that point in time is amazing. So we're very grateful that you were able to step in and write about Dr. Mack and present to us in your book a lot of the background. It's amazingly well written. So I know you're humble in all regards, but it's easy reading and informative, and you do belong in the pantheon of those who are legends in writing. So we're very happy to have you here and share your thoughts and experiences regarding Dr. Mack, and perhaps a little bit more. So with that, back to you, Victor, and we're off to the races here.
Sure. The Believer is Ralph's book. The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. The one thing, just to get things started a little bit, how does a crime writer and someone who writes about the arts and all that, how did you make the leap from all of that type of writing at the New York Times and decide, you know what, I'm going to take a run at, along with my colleagues, this whole UFO issue at Pentagon UFOs, UAPs? Let's talk about that for a second. How the audience is going to react to that. How did that all come about? What kind of motivated you?
Well, in the same way, Victor and guests, that John Mack, a noted psychiatrist, got captivated, as I say, not captured, captivated by UFOs and the alien abduction phenomenon. It kind of found him, and it kind of found me. So my whole background was investigative reporting. I wrote about the mafia and politicians and corruption and cops, very well-grounded, down-to-earth subjects. And one day I came across a copy of John Mack's second book, Passport to the Cosmos. I didn't know who he was. I was very naive. He was a bit naive too, I found out. But I knew nothing about him, even though he'd been in the New York Times and he'd been on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and he was really actually world famous, but he escaped my notice. And I thought naively, I might bring this man to the world. I'll focus attention on him for the first time. He was very well known by then. And I resolved to call him up and see if I could interview him, because again, a Harvard psychiatrist interested in alien abduction was something new, fairly sensational. And the next few days, I picked up the paper, and he was dead. He'd been run down in London by a drunk driver. And so obviously that quashed any chance of interviewing him, but I got very intrigued with the story, and that's what started me off.
Yeah, it's amazing that the synchronicity that you found out about him, wanted to talk to him, and then all of a sudden he was gone. That's amazing. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to one of our correspondents. Giorgio, would you like to throw a few things at Ralph and see how much more deeply we can dig into this?
Sure, thank you. I was reading Ralph's book, Believer, and also about his previous books. And what I noticed, Ralph, is that in your previous books, you delved into the lives of heroic trailblazers as well, whose actions changed society, usually for the better. Lawrence of Arabia, a prison warden who fought for more humanitarian treatment of prisoners, 2 FBI detectives who, against all odds, weakened the grip of the mafia. And finally, this book about a challenging, very scientifically honest psychiatrist who challenged the establishment taboo in the most iconic American university. But the conversation must be deepened, possibly including all kinds of otherworldly experiences, to promote necessary paradigm shifts. It seems from this UFO phenomenon and associated phenomena that the paradigm shift demands an inclusion of a greater reality. So I guess my general question would be, since you are now delving into the possibility of survival of physical death, along with Leslie Kean, are you looking forward to continuing going even deeper into the rabbit hole, so to speak, to join the ranks of post-materialist trailblazers? From humanitarian trailblazers to post-materialist trailblazers.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Julia, how you make the connection between other people who I regard as heroic, who I've profiled before in my books, and John Mack. There definitely is a thread running through them all. They were all heroic trailblazers in different ways, but they were similar in that they went against the grain. They were renegade enough and courageous enough to go against the establishment. So I'm pleased you made that connection. Working on the John Mack story really did open my eyes to a greater spiritual dimension to our lives. I mean, I was always somewhat spiritual, not notably religious. Like John Mack, I was brought up in a fairly secular German Jewish household. And not particularly attuned to the dictates of organized religion, but more and more, even as a young man, I felt that there was something more to the world than just the dimensions and the senses with which we can feel, taste, touch, and smell. There was something more to it, and I certainly adopted John Mack's view along the way, that there is something going on that is larger than any physical reality. So if you're asking, do I want to continue this work? I don't have another book in mind. I'm still recovering from the 16 years it took me to do this. But I certainly am more open now to anomalous experience and the paranormal world. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So I'm definitely open to it.
Do you see signs that other investigative reporters are opening up also to these issues that have to do with otherworldly and?
Definitely, there is a greater interest now by the government, the United States government, and certainly other countries. You all represent a nice cross section of the world where very often UFOs are taken more seriously. I know in Latin America, certainly. Europe, France, England, Belgium, they've all set up commissions to study UFOs more than and earlier than and more intensively than we did in the US. But now there's definitely something going on. The Navy, the Defense Department, and particularly the Navy, has been much more open to discussing these experiences. They are encouraging pilots to come forward with sightings, which they never did before. So yeah, I don't think that amounts to full disclosure, which a lot of people are waiting for. I think that's too optimistic, but definitely there's a new wave, that we're approaching now.
Wonderful.
Chrissy, I know you've got a couple of questions regarding journalists and how this all plays out. What's your take that you wanted to present to Ralph?
Yeah, Giorgio, that's a perfect segue into what I was going to ask. So Robert, Ralph, you did an article with Robert Bigelow called "Can Robert Bigelow and the Rest of Us Survive Death?" We see, and Leslie Kean's involved in this in the New York Times, we see a lot of connections with life after death right now with UAPs. Do you think that and I should say this as well, I've heard other stories now recently from other experiencers in all different categories that have connected life after death now. We don't know if they're lying, and we don't know if it's true. We're still trying to figure that out. Do you think that there is some kind of connection with UAPs and life after death, or is this just purely a Robert Bigelow connection?
Oh, it's not purely Robert Bigelow. Whitley Strieber,
or just in general, yeah.
Yeah, Whitley Strieber certainly thought there was a connection between alien abduction, the phenomenon, and death. And his wife Anne, who died actually a few years ago and with whom he is still in close touch, he says, certainly subscribe to that. People who've been abducted reported seeing dead relatives, others they knew had died on the ships. So there does seem to be some connection. You know, John Mack started off treating alien abduction when he discovered it, when he stumbled across it through Bud Hopkins. He treated it as something quite apart and singular. And more, as his career progressed, he realized that it really is part of a much larger mystery that encompasses other paranormal aspects like crop circles and cattle mutilations and Irish fairy tales and all kinds of other things, Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot. They're all sort of unexplained phenomena. And in the end, ultimately, survival of consciousness, life after death. He became more and more interested in that at the end of his life. He was pursuing a book on Elizabeth Targ, a wonderful, gifted young woman who died, was researching paranormal powers. She was testing power of distant prayer on aged patients who seemed to respond to it. So he was definitely into that. And I think there is a connection, if only because they're all different aspects of the paranormal phenomena, and they're hard to separate.
Are we going to see more of that? Do you think Bigelow, within what he's doing academically right now, are we going to see more of those connections within media coverage and just in general research that's coming out with UAPs and life after death in the next coming years?
But we'll definitely
see next year.
More, yeah, we'll definitely see more on survival of consciousness, life after death, afterlife experience, because Bigelow has a very powerful megaphone. I mean, that's what billions of dollars buy you today. He's a NASA contractor. He's invested heavily in studies of the paranormal. His Skinwalker Ranch that he bought in Utah was, replete with anomalous experiences. As you're referring to the story I wrote in the New York Times, Robert Bigelow funded this afterlife contest for the best evidence of life after death. And the essays, for which he's paying in total 3 prizes, more than $1 million, which is powerful incentive in any way you look at it. That will be due and judged later this year by November. So we'll definitely get some publicity on that. Then we'll see what the evidence is that he paid for, really, with his prizes. So I'll be very interested to see that. Leslie Kane is involved with the committee that's evaluating the responses. So we will, this is not going away. We'll definitely say, Leslie Kane, you probably know now, has a 6-part series on Netflix, Surviving Death, based on the book. So that got, a lot of attention. So, when you look at it, there are 2 big mysteries in the world, really huge mysteries. One is, are we alone in the universe? Is there other intelligent life? And the other is, what happens after we die? Nothing approaches these 2 questions in terms of, magnitude, power, mystery. So I'm sure we'll see more on that.
Right. And they may very well be connected to each other. As you mentioned, there is we talk about death, and death is a physical death, not necessarily death of the soul, death of the consciousness. So you do end up with if you will, a post-physical life consciousness. And how and where is that intertwined with the question that we're discussing here today? It's and how is that manifested to us? The communications and the interface that occurs today, whether it be through the abduction phenomena, telepathic communications, experiencers, mediums, and so forth, are these all one and the same? Are they subsets of a bigger picture? You're mentioning, are these two big questions, but they may very well be just one question. I know in past discussions we've had with Francisco, who is an expert in Fatima, what happened and the communications that occurred, is it was very religious. It was described as religious. It's spiritual, but not secularly so. It was words that were given to it by the people who were there, in that they were trying to define it by what they knew. And of course, Portugal at that time, very Roman Catholic, very tied to that. And you are naturally going to tie that to a very spiritual feeling. So what do I know as spiritual? I see this apparition that appears like a woman. I'm going to define her as the Virgin Mary appearing to me. It's man's attempt, humanity's attempt to define that which we experience. But we have so many experiences that we're talking about and that you're referring here to that they're beyond our capabilities still today to try to define them.
Well, you really put your finger on something. Both mysteries, survival of consciousness and alien abduction, and seem to involve breaking of barriers to another dimension. In one case, the dimension of death. How do we break through the physical body to a spiritual world where there is no death, where people who died live on in some form? And alien abduction concerns crossing into another dimensional boundary where impossible things happen. I mean, there's an epigram to my book at the very beginning where Sir William Crookes, a famous scientist in England in the 1870s, who was sent to debunk paranormal things like seances, came back basically a believer, and he said, "I never said it was possible, I only said it was true." So in both cases, death and abduction, there is a penetration of another dimension existing perhaps alongside ours. But I'm glad you mentioned the religious aspect, Fatima, because Diana Pasulka, who I'm a great fan of, a religious scholar, in her book, American Cosmic, talks about Fatima and the apparitions. And it's absolutely extraordinary how that, the religious aspect, that spirituality penetrates our world too. And that's why I guess the Vatican is one of the great followers of ufology, because they understand the hidden dimensions, whether they're religious or non-religious. There's something beyond our world that's out there.
Yeah, from a religious standpoint, if you look at it, and it doesn't matter whether if you can be Jewish, Christian, Islamic, everybody is dealing with, as they refer to, spirits or, other beings, gods, saints, some cases, some that are not, Nephilim and the jinn and others like that might have a little bit of nastiness or mischief tied to them, but still, obviously a connection, a religious connection to others beyond those that we see, hear, feel, touch in our 3D world that we experience on a regular basis. So it's interesting to see that. And as you mentioned, Diana Pasulka, somebody who is, her doctorate in theology, very much so, Catholic and into it. And the more you start to study it, and I love that quote, that I didn't say it was real. I just, it's just, you start looking at it and it makes you go, what really is possible? I had a friend of mine who's a physicist was visiting with me last night. And that's something that we talked about, how the laws of physics continuously change as we move forward.
I mean, the front page of the New York Times today has a wonderful article by Dennis Overby on a new particle that is possibly more significant than the Higgs boson, that may explain, the origins of the universe. But we're learning new stuff every day.
It's amazing, and it's they clearly define, and I say that like this, clearly define the age of the universe when I was way back when I was a kid, it being no more than 1 billion to 5 billion. Then it became 10. Then it became 15, 16, 18. No, I'm sure this time it is 18 billion. Well, we're sure of nothing.
Right.
We barely have an awareness of our 3D world. We're now proving mathematically that there are at least 10 dimensions. And in fact, as you go up the scale, it gets to be a little more prosaic and precise and easier to understand than in our very complicated, lower vibrational 3D world that we experience here.
Right.
With that, I'd like to, Francisco, we mentioned you there a little bit in your past here. Your insight into that here with Ralph.
Well, thank you, Ralph. And I would like to ask you two questions regarding John Mack's life and his research. When you had access to all his documents, knowing that he was an academic pioneer on the research of the abduction phenomena, but not being able to, in the initial phase of his research, not being able to cite other researchers and papers because non-existence, and needing to start from zero, from scratch, in defining the right approach and treatment for the cases that he was following. Those initial days must have been very enthusiastic, of course, but also struggling, demanding. What did you find in your research that made talk about his feelings back then? And another,
yeah, go ahead.
and another question was, Mack said that the contact abduction phenomena had philosophical, spiritual, and social implications, which may tie also to the discovery of past life existence. Can you expand a little about his thoughts and also your thoughts about this?
Great. Yeah, those are all very meaty questions. First of all, John Mack was never at a loss for self-confidence. He was supremely confident, very tall, commanding figure, intellectually brilliant, towering intellect, cobalt blue eyes, magnetic to men and women, which sometimes got him into trouble with his wife, his poor suffering wife, Sally. But so he didn't lack confidence. And the fact that he was plunging into a new area, it didn't particularly worry him. He did what all good scientists do. He gathered around him a group of experiencers, his own group, because Bud Hopkins had done some of that before him. And Bud Hopkins, who had got him started in the field by giving him a bunch of letters that he had received, that Bud had received from experiencers, got John Mack interested. But he plunged ahead on his own, and he wasn't very worried, from what I could see, going through his archives, that he didn't have a lot to go on. He was happy to be out there alone, and he made no secret of it. He convened meetings at Harvard and spoke about his observations even before he probably should have. He might have held off a little bit. So I mean, that part didn't bother him much. Now, remind me again, the second part of your question, you were
regarding philosophical, social, spiritual implications.
He was distinguished from other abduction researchers by seeing in their stories, in the abductees' stories, a transformational aspect, apart from the trauma, which was undeniable. The people who came forward with these stories of being confronted by alien beings and beamed through their solid walls to a ship and being subject to pseudo-medical experiments and reproductive procedures and taking of eggs from women and sperm from men to produce a hybrid race. I mean, fantastic stories. That was clearly traumatic and painful, and people recounting these stories would weep and curse and cry out, which convinced John that it was an authentic experience on some level, in some reality. Anyway, that was undeniable. But John Mack also saw, almost alone, to the exclusion of any other researcher in the field, a transformational aspect to what these people were going through. He found that they came out more dedicated to conserving the earth, more worried about the fate of the planet, more resistant to despoiling, to pollution, more aware of spiritual dimensions, connecting with a great spirit or a deity. And that often left them with a positive feeling about their abduction experience that overrode all the trauma. So John saw that, and others like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, who also did research, who were much more, Hopkins and Jacobs were much more wedded to the idea of these abductions are happening in real time, in a recognizable reality, and they're traumatic. The aliens are on some evil mission to steal our DNA. I mean, I'm simplifying, but that was generally their take on the experience, unlike John Mack's, which was, yes, it's traumatic, but there's a message that the alien beings are imparting along with it. So that made him stand out, and it was basically a positive message, and it opened him up to, all kinds of spiritual growth that others didn't necessarily share.
Yeah, it's really interesting how he handled all of that. I know Ralph and I've talked about this earlier in my interactions with John Mack. There was the stature of the man, and then behind it, as I found out as a result of Ralph's book, there was another persona behind all of that. And it was one that questioned everything. He was an activist with respect to a lot of different things. I'm going to throw it to Giorgio, because I know, Giorgio, you have a question regarding the integrity of intelligence companies or agencies with respect to some of the stuff that's going on.
Well, yes, it's probably not a nice question to ask, but I have to ask it because in the ufology community, even in the serious side of the community, historian Richard Dolan sometimes suggests that major newspapers like the New York Times are influenced by intelligence agencies, which for the sake of national security, occasionally control what can be said, even in terms of UFOs. Based on your vast experience at the New York Times, do you see how this could be possible, if at all?
Could be possible, maybe, but I'll tell you this. First of all, from my experience, I was not interfered with at all. I worked on this book for 16 years. I conducted numerous interviews with experiencers, with other researchers, everybody possible, and nowhere did I bump into anybody from the government, no men in black, who visited me or tried to influence my research. So I certainly can say 100% that I never felt any influence, nor, by the way, did John Mack. He also said that in all his research, and remember, this was very cutting edge research, and it may be counterintuitive. You would think that somehow he would have been visited at some point by government agents or people who had some interest in what he was doing. He said no. And I saw nothing in his archives to indicate the contrary, that he wasn't telling the truth. I saw no, and I saw all the emails and all the correspondence, so I would have run across it. Now, when I did this reporting for the New York Times on the secret Pentagon unit that was investigating UFOs, the story came out in 2017, and this unit had been operating since at least 2007. In my reporting and the reporting that Leslie Kane and Helene Cooper, we did together as a threesome, at no time were we ever contacted, or as far as I know, were our editors contacted. So I can tell you that part of my experience is absolutely solid. Now, in the past, have intelligence agencies asked the New York Times to withhold stories? Yes. The famous cases with the Bay of Pigs invasion, when the New York Times had gotten wind of it early, that Cuban exiles were being trained to invade Cuba and Guatemala, and we were ready to go with the story. President Kennedy asked the New York Times to hold it back because obviously it would have compromised the invasion. It was a clear national security issue if we had broken that story. And the Times held the story back. History will, record the result. The invaders were, massacred. And President Kennedy later said it would have been better if the New York Times had gone ahead with the story, because it would have saved, all that bloodshed and disaster. And that's not the only example. Throughout history, the Times has had relationships. Times reporters have had relationships with intelligence agencies, and they've shared information. The OSS, during the war, and the CIA have always, tried to influence coverage over the years. That's historically accurate. They put out disinformation. That's another sad truth. But I was telling you first, my personal experience was that nothing of that kind occurred. But on a larger level, historically, yes, the media have been manipulated, and intelligence agencies have put out disinformation, and you know, there are many cases to cite there going back. So it's probably a two-part answer to your question. You know, what I experienced and what I know from reading has gone on in the past.
I know Chrissy and I have had a lot of discussion regarding
Let me
this
add
because,
something.
okay, go
Victor.
ahead, Giorgio. Yep, go
Sorry.
ahead.
So I guess that us in the UFO community also have to update our biases and premises of what's going on. We all have to work together and update our beliefs. That's it.
Yeah, Chrissy and I had this discussion before with respect to, and I know she got a question related to that. And there's so much information coming out with respect to this issue and other related media and intelligence issues. And Chrissy, I know you've got a question. Who do you trust, really?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was, you know, Ralph, when you're looking at people in the community, activists, journalists, investigators, who do you trust and who do you not trust? Because we have, and I know it's a hard question in context because we have a lot of politics in the UFO world right now. And if you're embedded in it, you'll see the politics from all different sides and groups that have information that they're releasing. Who do you know, on your end, because you've talked to so many people in the community, who do you trust and who don't you?
Okay, well, let me answer that first the way John Mack would have answered it and did answer it. When he was asked basically the same question, how do you know that these experiences are telling the truth? And he said, look, I'm a psychiatrist. This is my job. If you're an art appraiser and someone shows you a Rembrandt that they, you know, want to sell you, you know, you should be able to know pretty quickly whether it's authentic or not. He said, well, I'm the same way. I'm a psychiatrist. When people come to me with stories about experiences they've had, I know pretty quickly whether they're insane or deluded or fabricating, making it up. So he said, that's what I do. So I'm not putting myself on the same level. I'm not a psychiatrist, but as a reporter, I have to decide all the time whether the people I'm talking to are telling me the truth, whether I'm getting a good story or not, what the agenda of the person is. So I filter out, you know, I filter information all the time in everything I do as a reporter. Sometimes it's a sixth sense. Sometimes I'm able to check, you know, on best of cases, you can check information with other people. You're right that the internet is a wild west, especially when it comes to UFO, you know, devotees. There's all kinds of stuff out there. We've dealt with some of it, Leslie and I, in our reporting, trying to sort out the stories that you can confirm and you can't. And sometimes things that are probably true can't be confirmed, so we don't report them. You know, people say, well, why didn't you report this in the New York Times? So what about that? You didn't go far enough. We know you've been researching this, but you never reported on it. Why not? And then they have conspiracy theories. Well, the government told you not to report. Not true. It didn't rise to the level of something we could, you know, report in the New York Times. But you put your finger on a real problem. So, these stories are inherently uncheckable. You know, when people come forward with personal anecdotal experience, as John Mack found, in the end, there was really very little proof that would satisfy anybody. So the answer to your question is it's difficult. It's often very difficult. And the best thing as a reporter is not to report on these things. If you're with mainstream publication like the New York Times, not to report on it until you have it solidly or at least sourced, so that you can say, this is where I got the information, and this person, readers, you can decide if this person is credible. If you say, as we did, for example, this information came from Luis Elizondo. He was the former head of AATIP. He has this background in intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. Now you decide whether he's likely to be telling the truth. If you don't give a named source, which often neophyte reporters particularly don't do, they say, you know, an informed source or well-informed source, you don't have that credibility that comes with it. So the best thing you can do sometimes, if you can't prove it yourself, is at least cite the source so readers can decide who's behind it. But there's no perfect answer to that question.
Do you feel that the key players within mainstream media right now, because there are a fair amount of them, not so much experiencers and people that are telling story in smaller outlets, but the mainstream people, do you feel that they're leading us in the proper direction? Or do you think, like outside of Bigelow, because I know that, you know, everyone has their different relationships, but do you think that they're leading us in the proper direction with this narrative? Because there are other key players that are not fully in the mainstream yet when it comes to all different types of programming and writing, and that their voices will hopefully be heard soon. But do you feel that the key players are telling the proper narrative to the general public?
When you say key players, you mean people in the government or people?
Both, like Lou Elizondo, Jeremy Corbell, Bigelow, you know, Tim McMillan, you know, MJ Banias. Like there's a lot of different players that have they're all working towards a goal of having more information and figuring out what this is.
Right.
Do you think that everyone's putting us in the direction that we should be going to have these larger conversations with people around the world?
Well, you know, each case, Christine, is different. I mean, you can't, one person's credibility doesn't bleed onto another person's credibility. You have to, you know, check each person individually. I put Tim's credibility very high, for example. I put Elisando's credibility very high. And I think the government undermined him, unfortunately. After our story came out, the Defense Department raised questions about whether he had ever been the head of AATIP. Very unfortunate. That really, it hurt him. I think it hurt the story. Didn't affect our credibility because in the end we were right and we never had to retract anything. We still consider Elizondo a very reliable source. We cite him again and again. But the government undermined him by, for whatever reason, you know, casting doubt on his story. But every person has to be evaluated separately, and people are complicated, and there's a mix of things. Now, the people who are putting out information most recently on the UAP task force, people like John Ratcliffe and Brennan and Marco Rubio have all made comments on it. Each one has to be assessed separately. You know, Ratcliffe was a short-lived member of the intelligence establishment for Donald Trump. He lasted about a month. He's no longer in office, so maybe that adds to his credibility. On the other hand, he has a record as a very conservative member, the most conservative member of the House from when he was a representative. So that, you know, factors in. You know, Rubio has his issues. So, you know, everybody has to be evaluated separately. And often you can cross-check the stories. You know, there's one person buttress another person's story. But there's no easy fix, like you can go somewhere and get a, you know, formula, okay, this person's credible, this person's not credible. You have to decide that as you go.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where in the next couple of years, where that narrative is going to be. And then when we look at the greater masses that are deciding on, you know, they've just learned about this subject and where we are in the next couple of years with all these people coming forward and talking about it. I'm curious to see how people are going to look at it from there to them, because their understanding of it and the general public who's just getting information about UAPs and learning it, it's coming from them. So I'm curious to see where the public's going to go with their ideology of UFOs in the next couple of years.
It's going to be very interesting, but I'll tell you this, I have a good feeling that it's moving in the right direction in terms of the government opening up, because the Navy and the Pentagon made a huge step in recent years by welcoming these reports and saying that they want the stories to come out. Now, how much they're willing to share with the public is another question, but at least we've come a long way from the days when airline pilots, for example, were told, do not, say you've seen a UFO, when we know they have. Commercial pilots see them all the time because the airlines say you'll lose your license. We won't have you flying if you talk about UFOs. Now it's different. So we are moving in the right direction.
Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you for that. And it's the believability part of this, as you mentioned, is also tied to whether or not people even believe in the subject matter. And you touched earlier in talking about Bud Hopkins and his experiences, and of course, Dr. Mack's investigation into, and the hundreds, thousands of people he actually interviewed and talked to and looked at about the phenomenon. And as horrifying as it might possibly be, given the experience that people went through, studies show that 75 to 80% of the people who experience it are okay with the next one happening. So they've been through a lot, but there's enough that's either positive about it or that they believe in, that it is indeed a good thing that happened to them, that they're willing to move forward. I think something else that has also changed is, and interestingly, the percentage is very close to it, is that we are at about 75% worldwide. People at least believe on some base level about the UFO experience and the phenomenology surrounding it. And of course, there's been so much that has been perhaps misidentified, everything from, sleep paralysis, the old hag syndrome, and things like that, that could potentially be cross-related to abduction and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting with that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, often the experiences feel they're privileged, that they have been let in on a secret, and that they are part of something that other people are not part of, and that they have been made privy by the alien beings to, some other dimension of the universe, that they have to speak out, and that they have been anointed in some way that other parts of humanity haven't been, which is interesting. One of the things that John Mack observed, and that others actually also said, was that researchers in this field have a tendency to reject things that don't fit. And a lot of the abduction stories don't fit each other. There's a basic symmetry to them, a basic consistency, but within that basic core narrative, there's a lot of things that are different. So they're not all reading off the same, script. And the things that are different are often cast aside by researchers because they're too hard to explain. If everybody has generally the same experience, that it's easy to follow. But somebody has something that's totally weird, like Whitley Strieber had, then the researchers say, well, I can't deal with that. That's just totally outside the realm. But then other researchers who I quote in my book, who are very smart, say it's the things that don't fit that really need to be investigated, because that's part of the story. And also, while you're at it, how about the people who aren't abducted? How come they're not abducted? So what is this phenomenon that chooses people based on what and why? So let's not just only talk to the people who've been, abducted or had abduction experiences. Let's talk to the other people and see how they differ, because there's the mystery.
Exactly. We've just got about 5 minutes left. I know Francesco has a question to ask Ralph. Francesco?
Just a very quick question in terms of speculation about how would you envision Mack's role in today's world approaching disclosure?
Wow.
If he was alive.
Yeah, he'd be fascinated. I mean, he was, his intellect roamed far and wide, and he would adapt to the new, thinking, and he would be fascinated. He was very nimble. He never let himself be, pigeonholed into one particular way of thinking. So he went from, as I said, abduction to crop circles to after death. And now if he thinks the government was coming forward, he'd be really excited. He wasn't a great fan of government per se. I mean, he was very much against George Bush's wars in Afghanistan, and he hated George Bush really for that. I can only imagine what he'd think of Donald Trump. That would have killed him if he wasn't already dead. But it's a nice thought to think how, I mean, he would be 90, let's see, he was born in 29, so he would have been 90.
91, 92.
which is not that old today, and he would still have a nimble mind, presumably, and be fascinated by everything that's going on. So it's a great loss that he's not with us.
Yeah, it is indeed. And I can't help but reflect back on the time I spent with him in his Cambridge office over 3 days back in 1996, I believe it was. And just the depth of the man. I guess the last thing I'd like to broach it if anyone else wants to kind of pose questions, but let me get this in. In doing all of this and reflecting back to what I said earlier on in the program with respect to the other writers, how much did you struggle with doing the biography and putting sentence after sentence to make sense of all of this and hoping that you were in fact making sense to the reader? How did you struggle in that, or did you at all struggle?
It struggled. I mean, that's why it took me 16 years. I mean, I don't know if I didn't work every day on it, but many days I did. And the hard part was to try to distinguish myself from John Mack. I didn't want to be a mouthpiece for John Mack because he was his own mouthpiece, and he wrote what he wanted to write. He wrote 2 best-selling books and tons of articles and interviews he gave. So I didn't want to just regurgitate that. I wanted to evaluate it. I wanted to keep my distance. And in the beginning, in early drafts, I didn't keep enough of a distance, and I had some, very skeptical readers who looked at it and said, "You've got to entertain other possibilities." And I consulted then anthropologists and skeptics, and that's why I put in the subtitle "Hard Science," because I subject some of John's hypotheses to hard science. And what the science say about the absence of real proof in these cases, which John also admitted. He came across that. He said, "I don't have the proof." So it was a struggle because it's a very complicated thing. You want to give, you're sympathetic to John Mack if you're a biographer, because you wouldn't be spending all this time with a guy you didn't basically like or think was important. But you have to, you have to be a critic as well. I pointed out that he was very naive at times. He was overly enthusiastic, which he admitted to the Harvard committee that investigated him. So it was that balance to be sympathetic and yet be a critic and be an outsider. That was the hard mix.
Right.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, and I think we have one last question here before we go from Giorgio. Giorgio, you had a follow-up question.
Thank you, Ralph. I was thinking about your possible soul-to-soul connection because I read the book. And there's a series of coincidences and events that seem to relate you with Dr. Mack's family, all the way from your attorney being working for Bud Hopkins and you being wake up in the night with information from John Mack. Just give us a general idea of this possible soul-to-soul situation.
Yeah, I mean, I read about synchronicities as articulated by Carl Jung, and I found the same thing. I mean, I went to, John Mack's father was a professor at City College when I was there. I knew his name. I was in the English department. He was an English professor. I didn't have him for a course, but I knew who he was. And now when I headed out on this book, I found out that I'm writing about the son of Ed Mack. And when I was I was trying to find a cousin who grew up with Mack. And I looked for him all over, and I found him living across the street from me. I had to cross the street for the interview. So there were a lot of incidents like that. And I did wake up at night sometimes thinking, I should put this in. I need to put this in. Now that could be any writer's, mind, wrestling with a subject all day long. You wrestle with it, and at night the answers sort of come. Now that's common. I'm not saying that was supernatural, but it could have been. It could have been, John Mack's spirit reaching out and reminding me, don't forget to put this in, Ralph. Because as I say at the end of my book, he did appear, or his spirit appeared to friends of his after he died. There were a number of accounts of people said, John Mack appeared to me after he died. And I have the anecdotes in the book. I said, I put it at the end because I'm not as confident of this material as the other material. It's strictly anecdotal. There's no proof, but they were persuasive in many ways. So, yes.
It might have been a metaphysical tap on the shoulder that,
yeah,
hey.
Yeah. right, do this, don't do this. So, who knows? But I must say, I believe that there's more to the universe, the cosmos, than just the 3 or 4 dimensions with time that we experience. That we're learning all the time. We don't know everything there is to know. That's for sure. There's more to be learned, and so I'm humble in that way.
Well, Ralph
Thank you very
Blumenthal,
much, Ralph.
yes,
Thank
Ralph
you.
Blumenthal, you've made us all smarter as a result of the past hour you spent with us, and I do thank you very, very much for your sense of intuition and your sense of journalism and all the things you do to try to push this issue forward. And I'm convinced that this book is going to be a gate opener for everyone listening and even beyond once they realize what you've started. So you've done a great job in doing that, and I congratulate you. So, Chris, back to you.
Sure. It is indeed a fascinating book, and we encourage everybody out there to please take the time and look for it to read for yourselves. Summer is coming up here, and make a wonderful summer on the beach as your toes are dangling in the water and a drink is in your hand. So it would be something good for all of us to pick up. Ralph, we want to thank you and echo Victor's words here. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been a fascinating discussion. And I want to thank each and every one of our correspondents and panelists for joining with us today for these wonderful, insightful questions. Thank you for your open and honest answers to these questions and your participation in this discussion. Till next time, we wish you all very well. And for those of us watching, please take the time to hit the like button. If you've not subscribed, please subscribe to The Future. We're at almost 500 subscribers right now. We've had over 10,000 views of our various interviews, and we will continue to bring them to you as we wish to continue our exploration and pushing and discovery of the new frontiers.
You've been listening to the New Frontier Network.